Hello and welcome back to Retro Ranger. The last time we took on the first half of the main series Harry Potter games, and surprisingly, they all brought something good to the table. Today we're going to go ahead and finish the back half of the series, and I'm really excited about what some of these advances in technology are going to be bringing to the games. Let's jump in.
Okay, this is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix on the PSP again. And I chose the PSP because the last one was so fun, but I knew it was too good to be true as this one is a stinker for sure. First, the controls have changed again, and here it's in no way intuitive or fun. To cast spells, you need to press the corresponding button, but then hold each until your wand glows brightest before releasing to cast it. Each spell takes a few moments that adds up, and if you hold it too long, the spell fizzles and you have to redo it. While this doesn't sound like a big deal, it makes the pace crawl as a result. It's a lesson in patience since it's tedious, and to further prove the point, you can't even cast a spell until you manually take your wand out with the R button. Why is this minute detail of wand and hand management in the game at all? When your wand is out, you're then tab targeting with the L button and the directionals. The whole thing is painful, slow, and in no way fun. Once more, you're wandering around in third-person mode between events, which would be fine if the controls were a bit more tight. For some reason, you don't run by default, so you now have to hold the X button to do that too. The story falls closer to the source material, which is something nice I can say, and the layout of the grand staircase is likely the closest to what we all remember from the movie visuals thus far. But unfortunately, that means that the castle is big, and so the developers included a map to help navigate. Where this falls apart, though, is that to help navigate the map, you get footprints on the ground to help direct you where to go. And to see those footprints, the camera needs to be angled down, of course. And so while there's a grand staircase and some of the other elements of the castle modeled, you usually get a view pegged at the ground the entire game. The biggest enemy, though, is the camera itself, and it is just terrible. It's bad enough that you're looking down all the time, but randomly will switch positions, and whatever direction you're holding will send you right into a nearby wall. Combine that with the awful frame rate, and this is pretty unbearable. I didn't make it very far before I had to turn it off, but I feel it's more than justified. You'll be running ridiculous errands for schoolmates to prove you're not mad since the Daily Prophet's been printing lies about you, and you need to hunt down copies of the Prophet itself and take them down, and I never remembered Harry caring so much about what others thought of him, but apparently so, at least according to this game. The biggest offender of these tedious quests is that once you gain access to the library, which of course you had to run someone's homework to them first to even get in the thing, you find a book high up on a bookcase. There's some plot hole about why you can't just cast the Accio spell and have it come down to you, that you have to pull random furniture together to climb up to get closer to where you can finally Accio the book to you. Only the physics is beyond terrible, and lining up the table and the bookcase is beyond frustrating to achieve.
Wingardium Leviosa! Wingardium Leviosa! Wingardium Leviosa! Wingardium Leviosa!
Once you finally do your Accio spell, it sends you to yet another bookcase for you to repeat the process. Are we having fun yet? No, right? Because not at all. It happens again. I kid you not, 2 more times before it finally lands on a table, which makes no sense at all since the whole point of the Accio spell is, of course, to bring things to you. Just to kick you while you're down, it turns out that the book is totally useless, and I can't make this up.
This isn't the right book. This is from the restricted section. It must have escaped.
Outside of good voice acting, where there is voice work, and the ability to duel classmates, well, the idea of it anyways, because the execution is also bad here, there's nothing really redeeming about this game, and I would encourage you to avoid it at all costs. I really hope the next game in the series is better than this. Okay, this is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince on the Xbox 360.
Severus Snape, swear to watch over Draco. Will you swear that if Draco fails, you will carry out the Dark Lord's orders?
I will.
Here we see a few major changes to the series. First, the graphics are understandably the highest fidelity of what we've seen thus far, really showing off the capabilities of the system. The flow of the game is a hybrid model by allowing some open exploration, but also pushing a linear, more on-rails experience at the same time. The story does follow close to the original material outside of some random distractions and tasks.
Leave me alone. Harry's going to introduce me to Imelda Vane.
On what?
I'll explain later. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I need some help.
Where is she?
What's the matter with Wenby?
A good example of these tasks include having to clean up the Weasley's yard, which introduces some new concepts like how spells are cast in this installment. To cover that quickly, spellcasting is largely tied to gestures on the right joystick, though some will require both joysticks as well. Starting out, I had a really hard time getting the spells to trigger, even though I was following the on-screen instructions. Turns out it was my controller, even though it appears to work just fine with other games. So after swapping my controllers, and that apparently requires restarting the Xbox 360 for some reason, it worked so much better. Flying again makes a return as you're the Quidditch captain for the Gryffindor team. In this installment, flying feels really tight, and the sensitivity in all directions is just well dialed in. This implementation is bar none the best of the entire series. As I mentioned, you'll be moving the plot forward by going from destination to destination in the castle and the surrounding grounds. Sadly, there's a run button again, but it's a bit silly how fast you go when you actually press it. I'm still puzzled as to why there's just not an acceptable speed that's on by default. Again, you'll need to find your way to those destinations, and here you get your own GPS where Nearly Headless Nick acts as your personal navigator, which is really silly, obviously, but it actually works well, and it's just nice when you compare it to looking at footprints on the ground. Since the story involves stumbling upon the potion book from the Half-Blood Prince, potion making is a major game mechanic, and it's strangely involved here where you have to follow instructions by picking up ingredients and tipping them in until you achieve the goal state. While these sections can get a bit too long for their own good, in general I enjoyed the concept and implementation, and I more so enjoyed just making a mess of my workstation. Another game mechanic worth mentioning is dueling, and it comes in 2 forms. The first is a dueling club where you learn some of the other offensive and defensive spells, but I found this a little bit on the boring side. The better form is the schoolyard fights that you can get into with Slytherin or other enemies, and you usually get to take on someone from Malfoy's gang as long as you're in Hogwarts. These felt engaging and motivating not to lose rather than just being in a dueling club match. There's also a club for potion making, but outside of the story required crossovers, I tended to steer a little bit clear of that. The explorable areas of the castle and outside are large, and outside of some maybe questionable choices on geometry, it's a nice and immersive experience. As the game goes on, you'll unlock more of that explorable space, and portraits become activated to be shortcuts, which can help, thankfully, reduce the distance between destinations. Overall, I really enjoyed this game. It was just smooth. The mechanics were fun, and it largely stuck to the story without too many distractions. The runtime kept the pace really nice, and it's just an overall solid experience. But perhaps that's just because the previous game was so bad. Let's move on, though, to the next game. Alright, here's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 on the Wii.
We flush ourselves in.
Apparently so.
That's bloody disgusting.
Just pull the chain.
So better be a magical toilet. Blimey.
Of course, since they split up the last movie into 2 parts, you knew that the game was going to follow suit and do the same. On the Wii, it of course uses motion controls to aim and look around, which works great for the most part. Turning can get a little bit awkward as you do need to move the cursor to the edges of the screen to pan the camera in that direction, but it's also easy to move beyond the end of the screen, which just pauses turning altogether. You still only play as Harry, and it's in a third-person view as you move about the various locations. The graphics are great, and the voice acting sounds close enough to the real thing that it probably is.
What do you think, Harry? Harry?
I really felt they got the story parts right as they follow closely and streamline where they can to keep the pace going well. While there are cutscenes, thankfully they don't prevent you from actually playing the good parts like some of the previous installments. Spells are purposely selected from a menu, and you earn more as the game goes on. Harry gains experience points like an RPG, and as he gains levels, new spells will unlock, as well as his existing ones will get more powerful. Most of the combat will consist of spamming the stupefy spells, and as long as you have decent aim, the game is easy enough to progress. The game runs well on the Wii, and there wasn't a ton of tedious elements which really feel like a great way to experience the story. The only gripe I do have is that after a bit of following the main story, you're going to randomly get a screen for encounters, and these come in 3. These are self-contained side missions that you have to complete in full before you can proceed with the story. They're not particularly fun, and since they don't tie into the story, it's a blatant way to add runtime to the game, and it's really for no reason. You'll need to do these, unfortunately, a few times before the end. Beyond that, it's a pretty quick game, and I finished it in about 4.5 hours. This was a fun entry into the series, thankfully, but I also feel like they could have done more here with the Wii's motion controls. I'm thinking something to do with simulating the spell casting instead of just being a third-person shooter. After part 1 comes part 2, so let's finish this list off.
Thank you so much, Stupefy.
Okay, lastly, here's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 for the Xbox 360.
There's a Horcrux at Hogwarts, something to do with Ravenclaw. We have to go there.
One problem. Snape's headmaster.
In this series' conclusion, we jump ahead to the year 2011, and it shows in a few ways. First, the graphics and the gameplay are very polished. The game is almost entirely a third-person shooter with some sequences that mix up the gameplay slightly. While you can't change the person that you're controlling, as that's entirely driven by the game, interestingly, you can get to play as a ton of different characters as the story progresses, including Professor McGonagall, Seamus, Neville, and many more.
Stupefy!
The story thankfully keeps to the plot of the movies and the books, and there's no real distractions like it from the previous installments. Perhaps the only caveat to that would be actually getting to experience some of the assumed parts that you don't get to see in the movies, like Ron and Hermione getting to the Basilisk's fang in the Chamber of Secrets, for instance, or how Neville rigs up the bridge to collapse. And while these take some liberty to fill in those gaps, there's still some central component to them that really tie into the whole story, and it's certainly fun.
Come on! Neville! That's it!
Come on!
Behind you!
No!
The best part is likely the pace. It moves well, and while the shootout scenes can still be a bit long and repetitive, it's probably the best implementation overall. And while the shooting genre is likely matching the tone of these later books and movies, I have to admit that I do miss the puzzles from the earlier entries in the series, as there's really none in this game. Spells work great by assigning the active spell to a face button of the controller, leveraging things like double presses to be able to fit them all in. One thing that I learned is that the wands have recoil, I guess, and the more you shoot, the less accuracy you'll get, and the reticle aimer will widen to indicate this like a typical shooter. Just let your wand cool down a bit and it will reset and you're able to move forward.
So you're in. That will save you searching out.
Beyond that, there's not much to tell. This is likely the best experience of the movie or book in the entire series, and it's just really well put together. While the earlier installments had some fun puzzles and exploration, this one feels probably the most faithful to the story and theme, and I had a really hard time putting this one down.
I said I'd defend Hogwarts. I meant it.
And there you have it, each major installment in the Harry Potter series. It's hard to pick my favorite, as each brought some good and some bad. I really enjoyed the puzzles and the ability to switch characters from the Prisoner of Azkaban. The Goblet of Fire kept the gameplay tight, and I really liked those branching levels. And the Deathly Hallows Part 2 was just a really well-executed finale. If I had to pick, though, I'd have to say I had the most fun with the Half-Blood Prince, though you could likely choose whichever book or movie you prefer the best. Maybe just steer clear of the Order of the Phoenix. Anyways, let me know which games of the series was your favorite and which Harry Potter games outside of the main installments that I need to get on my list. Until next time, though, of course, thank you for watching Retro Ranger.